Alex Ovechkin went first in 2004, and nobody has spent the last 20 years arguing with that decision. Washington took the goal scorer with the huge shot, the heavy frame, and the star power. That part aged exactly how they hoped it would. The rest of the top 10 is where the draft starts to get interesting. 9 more names came off the board right after Ovi, and every one of them had to deal with the same question hanging over his career. Could he ever make a team regret passing on him for Ovechkin? The answer changes depending on the player, and in one case, it gets close enough to be worth a real debate. So let's go through picks 10 through 2, look at where they came from, what kind of NHL careers they built, and whether any of them ever had a real case to jump Ovi in a redraft. Some had long careers, some barely got started. A couple gave their teams exactly what they wanted. One became a Hall of Fame level player. Most never had a real shot at passing Ovechkin. Atlanta used the 10th pick on Boris Valabik, a 6'7" defenseman out of the Kitchener Rangers. This was a very 2004 kind of bet. Massive frame, mean streak, long reach, plenty of penalty minutes. And the idea that if the skating held up, you might end up with a nightmare matchup on the back end. In junior, he looked the part physically and made the OHL and CHL all-rookie teams before his draft year. The NHL version never really arrived. Valabik played 80 games for the Thrashers, spent a lot of time in the AHL, won a Calder Cup with Chicago in 2008, and then finished his career in Europe before retiring in 2017. He had size, he had edge, and he had enough ability to get a real shot. He just never became a top-pairing defender or even a steady NHL regular. There was no point where Atlanta could look at this pick and think that they had found a better option than Ovechkin. Anaheim took Ladislav Schmid at number 9, and this one at least produced a real NHL player. Schmid came out of Liberec in the Czech system and already had experience playing against men, which gave him a more mature profile than some of the junior forwards in this range. He was never sold as an offensive defenseman. The appeal was simple: tough minutes, penalty killing, reliable defending, and a player who could handle hard assignments without needing power play touches to matter. That is more or less what he became. Schmid played more than 500 NHL games, mostly with Edmonton and later Calgary, and built a long career as a shutdown defender. Back injuries kept chewing away at the later years, and he eventually went back to Liberec before retiring in 2022. For a 9th overall pick, the offense was light, and the ceiling stayed lower than teams hoped for in the top 10. Though he still gave Anaheim, and the teams after them, a better career than several other names in this draft range. Ovechkin was never under threat here, though Schmid at least gave his teams honest NHL value. Columbus took Alexander Picard at number 8, a winger from the QMJHL who could really score in junior. With Lewiston, he put up the kind of numbers that get a player drafted high, and even won the Mike Bossy Trophy in the Q for being the league's top professional prospect. At that point, the Blue Jackets were betting on touch, release, and top 6 upside. The NHL career was short. Picard played only 67 NHL games, almost all of them with Columbus, and never found a regular role at that level. The pro career itself lasted a long time because he kept playing in the AHL and in Europe. And he even had a huge run with Norfolk in 2012, winning the Jack Butterfield Trophy as playoff MVP during their Calder Cup title. That gave him a real pro highlight after the NHL path stalled out. Still, when you spend the 8th pick on a winger and he tops out at 67 NHL games, the pick goes into the miss column. No redraft case over Ovechkin here. Florida went with Rostislav Olesh at 7, another player who had already been skating against men before the draft. He came from Vitkovice in the Czech League, had size, speed, and a good enough all-around game to project as a top 6 forward. He was not some out-of-nowhere reach. He was a serious prospect, and for a while, the pick looked defendable. Ovechkin did a fair amount in the NHL and had stretches where he looked useful. He spent most of his NHL time in Florida, then got traded to Chicago in the Brian Campbell deal, and later had a short stop in New Jersey. He finished with 365 NHL games and 134 points before spending the back half of his career in Europe and retiring after a very long run in pro hockey overall. For Florida, the issue was that the offense never grew enough. He stayed in that middle space. Not a bust in the purest sense, not a difference maker either. Passing Ovechkin was never part of the conversation. The Rangers took Al Montoya at 6, and goalies always make these drafts feel different because the timeline is slower and the projection is harder. Montoya came out of the University of Michigan with a strong college resume and looked like a possible long-term starter. He also became the first Cuban-American player in NHL history, which gives his story a place in league history beyond the draft slot itself. The problem for New York was simple. He never became the franchise goalie they thought they were getting. Montoya bounced through the Rangers system, debuted later with Phoenix, and ended up building a respectable NHL career as a backup with the Coyotes, Islanders, Jets, Panthers, Canadiens, and Oilers. He retired in 2019, then moved into off-ice matters. A 6th overall goalie pick still needs more than solid backup for years to feel like a win. Ovechkin was never getting touched by this one. Before we get into the top 5, this is where the draft starts to separate a little. The bottom half gave you a couple real NHL players, a few disappointments, and nothing close to an Ovechkin challenge. The top half is stronger. One name in there gives you a real argument. A couple others built careers teams would happily take again. Phoenix took Blake Wheeler at 5, and this pick is fascinating because Wheeler never actually signed with the Coyotes. He went the college route at Minnesota, stayed there for 2 years, and then signed with Boston as a free agent. So, Phoenix spent the 5th pick on a player who never played for them, which is a brutal outcome, even before you look at what Wheeler eventually became. And what he became was a very good NHL player, then moved to Atlanta and Winnipeg and became one of the central players in that franchise for more than a decade. He wore the captain's C, put up a 91-point season, made multiple All-Star teams, and finished his career with 1,172 NHL games and 940 points before retiring in July 2025. In a redraft, Wheeler climbs. He had a better career than several players taken ahead of him. He still does not catch Ovechkin. Their production gap and goal-scoring gap are too large. Carolina took Andrew Ladd 4th overall out of the Calgary Hitmen. Ladd's profile was not flashy. He was a big winger, played a mature two-way game, scored 75 points in his draft year, and looked like the kind of player coaches trust because there are no weird swings in his game. He was not built around one elite trait. He was built around usefulness. That usefulness turned into a very strong NHL career. Ladd won a Stanley Cup as a rookie with Carolina in 2006, won another with Chicago in 2010, became captain in Atlanta and then Winnipeg, and finished with more than 1,000 NHL games. His peak years were not superstar years, though they were very good, and the leadership resume is strong. The later part of his career got rough because of injuries, especially with the Islanders, and he was done after the 2021-22 season. If you're grading this as a 4th overall pick, Ladd gave teams a lot. If you're grading him against Ovechkin, there's no real debate. Chicago took Cam Barker 3rd overall, a big left-shot defenseman from the Medicine Hat Tigers. In junior, he looked like the modern offensive defenseman teams wanted. Good puck skills, power play value, and enough size to handle himself physically. He also won back-to-back World Junior gold medals with Canada, so the resume heading into the NHL was strong. He did have one good NHL season. In 2008-09, Barker put up 40 points in 68 games for Chicago. And for a while, it looked like he might settle in as a real top 4 option. It never held. Chicago moved him to Minnesota in 2010. The NHL career kept sliding after that, and he finished with 310 NHL games before continuing in Europe and retiring from pro hockey in 2021. For a third overall pick, that's a letdown. Barker had enough ability to show flashes, though the full version of the player never stuck. Ovechkin was out of reach from the moment their NHL careers started separating. Then you get to number 2, and this is where the conversation becomes real. Pittsburgh took Evgeny Malkin out of Magnitogorsk, and from the beginning, he looked like the one player in this draft who could stand next to Ovechkin without the comparison feeling unfair. Big center, elite hands, real creativity, and production against men in Russia before he even came to the NHL. Once he arrived in Pittsburgh, he immediately looked like a franchise player. Malkin won the Calder, won 2 Art Ross trophies, a Hart, a Ted Lindsay, and a Conn Smythe. He helped the Penguins win 3 Stanley Cups and is still one of the defining players of his era. If you're searching for anyone drafted after Ovechkin who had a real path to first overall in a do-over, this is the name. NHL.com's own 2020 redraft still kept Ovechkin first and Malkin second, which feels right. Malkin built a Hall of Fame career. Ovechkin built one of the great goal-scoring careers the sport has ever seen. That is the margin. It's narrow compared to the rest of the field, though it is still there. So, what happened to the 9 players drafted after Alex Ovechkin in the top 10? A few became useful NHL players. Wheeler and Ladd had long, strong careers. Schmid carved out a real role for years. Montoya lasted and stayed in the game after retirement. Barker, Olesh, Picard, and Valabik never matched the value teams want from those draft slots. Malkin is the only one who ever made the first overall discussion worth having. Even then, Washington still sleeps fine with the choice it made in 2004. That draft gave the league 2 all-time names right at the top. Then, a lot of decent careers, a few misses, and one question that always comes back when people look at the order. Could anyone after Ovi have passed him? The honest answer is short. Only Malkin made it close.